Hey class, welcome back to History 18. Sorry for the interruption, but we are going to pick up right where we left off in Chapter 19, Part 2. So just to orient ourselves, we were talking about World War I and United States entry into World War I. Here are the key terms that we discussed last time, some of them. And I believe that we left off at the 369th Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, and we were about to discuss the Battle of Meuse Argonne, which is the Battle of the Argonne Forest that takes place in 1918. It is also the last major German military offensive in this war. It is also the battle in which the most American casualties were suffered in World War I. So we're going to focus on that one. And then after we talk about that and the armistice, we're actually going to kind of go back a little bit and talk about how the war is impacting the United States. And then we're going to talk about the treaty, the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so Wilson was trying to find a moral imperative for this war, and that's where he came up with his 14 points, which he presented to the United States Congress, and it talks about, having free trade, open agreements, democratic institutions, and self-determination for nations, right? Unfortunately, he was talking specifically about self-determination for European nations, which, as I mentioned last time when we talked about this, that's going to cause a lot of unhappy colonized populations around the world. But his 14 points are important because basically, not only do they sort of lay out an outline for possible peace after the war, but they also are giving people hope that maybe there could be this end to a war that is not a punitive end, right? This peace without victory. Unfortunately, it turns out that this is not what France and England envisioned in terms of a peace settlement. But it did inspire the 14 points, inspired lots of people around the world to hope that there could be a peaceful resolution to this conflict, including the Germans. And the Germans, this is one of the reasons why the Germans agreed to the armistice. We talked about the U.S. road to war, the Battle of the Somme, the resuming of unrestricted warfare on the Germans' part, the Zimmermann telegram, which you see pictured there, and then the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas in Russia, starting off the revolution there, which will end in the Bolshevik Revolution of October of 1917, which is the big communist revolution that takes place in Russia. And then the Congress votes for a declaration of war against Germany in 1917. And the U.S. is going to have to mobilize their military forces. The U.S. Congress passes the Selective Service Act, which says that all men over 18 must register for the draft. Then we talked about the military force that will get deployed to Europe. That is the American Expeditionary Force, headed up by General John Blackjack Pershing, who will basically become the head general in the American operations over in Europe. I also have listed here some of the numbers in terms of troops forward. And then we talked about these guys, the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Regiment fighting for the Americans in a segregated regiment, but eventually ending up fighting for the French on the front lines of World War I. In fact, they are the first American soldiers to see combat in World War I. However, they were officially fighting for the French, and they will earn the highest military medal of honor from the French government, the War Cross, which you see pictured there. Okay, so last time we talked about how the Americans enter World War I officially in 1917, But most American soldiers do not see combat until 1918, with the exception of the Harlem Hellfighters, right, the 369th. In spring of 1918 is when Germany decides to launch some of these massive offensive strikes against the Allied forces, and this happens both at the French ports and on the Western Front. Also, by this time, the Russians have removed themselves from the war after their revolution. And so at this point, this is now a one-front war, basically, with German forces concentrating on the Western Front. So because of all of that, the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, is dispatched to the central sector of the Western. And from September to November of 1918, there will be one particular battle that really sticks out in this war for American soldiers, and that's the Battle of the Argonne Forest, also known as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. This is a massive offensive carried out by German forces against the Allied forces, and as you can see, the AEF will suffer 45,000 casualties in just 4 days of fighting. So this is the heaviest loss of American life over the entire course of World War I. However, the American soldiers were quite numerous by this time, and we had built up quite a force there in France, and so we were able to continue to replenish the lines, so that at a certain point, the Germans agreed to an armistice. And this will be the sort of final battle of World War I, and like I said, the most dramatic and the most deadly for the Americans. So when the Germans agree to an armistice, this is something that is not popular in all of Germany. Some Germans feel like they shouldn't have to agree to an armistice, but the thing was that there was a lot of other factors going on at the time, including the influenza pandemic, which was killing a bunch of soldiers on the front lines of World War I. You also had a lot of civil unrest in Germany itself. Germany had just, their Kaiser had just been overthrown. There had been a naval mutiny. So there was all these other sort of internal issues within Germany as well. So I'm going to show you a map now. This map is basically showing where the armistice line is at the end of World War I. So if you look at that funny looking line with the triangles, you can see that that is where the armistice line is drawn. It's drawn, the war is basically scheduled to cease, a ceasefire, which is what an armistice is, on November 11th at 11 a.m. So that is why, you know, we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th. It used to be called Armistice Day, but now it's called Veterans Day to honor all vets. So November 11th at 11 a.m. is when the armistice was scheduled for. That's when they stopped firing. There was a little bit of sporadic fighting that took place after that, basically from people that didn't really get the memo that the war was over. But for the most part, the fighting ends at that time. You'll notice also on this map that all of those orange areas that you see, those are all areas that were American gains made by the Americans. And you can see that significant gain there in the Argonne Forest, in that very last offensive. So the other thing to point out on this map is that the armistice line does not really go into Germany. I mean, it goes across the entire Western Front, but not Germany. That later on becomes an issue for a lot of Germans, including Adolf Hitler, who think that the Germans should have never agreed to the armistice. But the Germans do agree to the armistice, and they agree to the armistice for the reasons that I mentioned: internal conflict, the influenza epidemic, which was killing lots of soldiers on the front lines, and finally the 14 points, Wilson's 14 points. They thought that if the Allies would follow those 14 points in the peace settlements, then they would be willing to live with that. So the next few slides are going to talk specifically about how World War I really impacted the United States domestically. And the first is, the World War I is the first example of total war in American U.S. history. That is, you have this war on such a massive scale that all of the industry, all of the agriculture, all of the transportation, everybody was expected to contribute in some way to the war effort. And there were lots of different ways that you could do this. Obviously, industry was ramped up to manufacture wartime materials. You have massive agricultural production during World War I, because not only is the United States trying to feed itself and its own people, but it's also feeding Europe during World War I as well. All of the transportation services in the United States were basically taken over by government and regulated by the government during this time in order to make sure that troops could be mobilized effectively. Keep in mind that troops had to be transported across the country, primarily on trains, to various military bases, and that they would either get trained there or they would be deployed across the ocean, across the Atlantic to France, where they would get training there. So it was this huge effort. This was challenging for a lot of people. Americans are very used to being independent and very used to sort of having, their ways of life not interrupted. And so this did, some people resisted, but in general, most people, stepped up and decided that they would, plant Liberty Gardens, like the image that you see there. You can see this woman saying, plant and raise your own vegetables, and this was in an effort to try to minimize the impact that the agricultural demand would have on industrial agriculture. Another important change that takes place in World War I is that of the workers and the labor unions. So there was a real concern during World War I that there would be labor strikes, because this had been an ongoing, recurring theme in U.S. history up until this point. And so labor for a while during World War I really enjoyed a temporary benefit. In other words, the government told businesses and corporations throughout the country to treat their workers well so that they would be happy. And unemployment was at an all-time low during World War I. We had about a 1.8% unemployment rate, which is really, really low during the time of the war. So basically, if you wanted to be employed, you could be employed during World War I. Things were temporarily good for workers. The wages went up. Some workers were offered and promised bonuses after the war. A lot of people were working 8-hour work days. So this was a huge improvement for labor and for workers. However, the problem was that none of these things became law, so that once the war was over, poor working conditions returned for a lot of the workers after World War I. So it was temporarily a good thing for workers during the war that these conditions improved, but after the war, it went right back to business as usual. And that will cause a bunch of underlying labor conflicts that will emerge after the war. And you're going to see a massive labor movement emerge as a result of the fact that people were so disappointed that their conditions, their work conditions had improved, but they had only improved temporarily, and they went back to normal after the war. Okay, another major thing that happens during World War I is a massive internal migration of people, and specifically African Americans, who were leaving the South in very large numbers during World War I to move into northern industrial cities. So, for example, Chicago or Cincinnati or Cleveland or Detroit, places in the North that had big wartime industries that were emerging. African Americans were taking that opportunity to move out of the South and move to these northern cities. This is often referred to in American history as the Great Migration. And it's important for a lot of reasons, but the primary reason why it's important is eventually, similar to what happens with labor, eventually this migration of people changes significantly the demographics in these northern cities. And what will come out of it will be a lot of racial tension. And so what you're going to see is in 1919, the year after World War I, there's going to be these horrible race riots that are going to emerge during the summer of 1919, and it's very bloody and it is very violent. But anyway, so that's going to be the ultimate reason why this particular phenomenon is important. And also, just changing the demographics of the country in general is really important, right? Whenever that happens, that tends to change the natures of cities. It changes culture within the cities, all kinds of things. So very important development in American history, and it was prompted by the outbreak of World War I. So women are also going to contribute to the war effort pretty extensively, both at home but also abroad. You'll see that 25,000 American women will serve in France during World War I. Most of these women were nurses, some of them were ambulance drivers, some of them were secretaries. There was a number of support positions that they played during World War I. There, at home, there was massive job opportunities for women. Women, just like World War II, were going to work in factories and doing industrial jobs, jobs that they had never been open to them prior to World War I. And so this is important, an important contribution by women to the war effort, but it's also important because some women are growing accustomed to having their own income, to maybe being a little bit more independent in terms of their movement in public space. So that's important, and it is an important development that we're going to kind of see carry over into the 1920s when we talk about the new women and the flappers of the 1920s. So here you have an image of women during World War I doing what was typically men's work, right? So we're all kind of familiar with the Rosie the Riveter image from World War II. This is like the Rosie the Riveters of World War I. Okay, another major thing that's happening in the United States as a direct result of World War I is this sort of enforced patriotism. And an example of that is the Committee on Public Information, also known as the CPI. Their job was to get Americans to support the war. So again, going back to the government being scared of disruption, being scared of protests, being scared of discontent, right? During the war, you want to try to get everybody on board and everybody on the same side. And so there's a lot of, the CPI's job is basically to promote pro-war propaganda. So an example of this is that they hired 25,000 Minutemen, and their job was to go out into the U.S. and give these 4-minute scripted speeches that they would give in public places like libraries and in front of city hall buildings, basically places where people gather. And their job was basically, like I said, to give this scripted 4-minute speech on why people should support the war. So that was one of the things that the CPI did. The other thing is, like you see here, this poster, they were really pushing for patriotism and conformity. People were encouraged to basically look on their neighbors suspiciously if they were doing some kind of activity that may be suspicious, or maybe they were having public gatherings where they could be plotting some anti-war strategies, whatever. So the CPI's was basically a propaganda agency run by the federal government, whose job it was to get Americans to support World War I. So the other thing that's happening during World War I is, again, the government, out of, I guess, paranoia, really, is wanting to ensure that there are no spies in the United States, and that people are conforming and agreeing to help the war effort. So there were two major acts that were passed during World War I by the United States Congress. The first was the Espionage Act, and this basically put a crackdown on, obviously spying activities, but it also made it illegal for there to be any kind of like socialist newspapers or labor union, any kind of like radical sort of political activist type groups. It made that activity illegal. So that was the Espionage Act, passed in 1917. In 1918, there was an even more dramatic act passed called the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act made it illegal to speak out against the government, including speaking out against the draft. And I think I mentioned when we talked about Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party leader, that he had actually been in prison during World War I for making an anti-war speech. And he was sentenced to 10 years for making an anti-war speech. And the reason why they were able to do that is because of these acts, the Espionage and Sedition Acts. So there was a huge crackdown on labor unions, socialists, any kind of intellectual opposition. So, for example, professors at Columbia University that might speak out against the war, they were getting fired for doing so. And there was also mass deportations during this time of people that might have been suspected of being more politically, radical leaning. A lot of those Eastern Europeans that I mentioned when we talked about immigration, a lot of them were suspect, and some of them will be deported during World War I. Emma Goldman, who we talked about in class, the famous anarchist, was deported during World War I after she had protested against the draft. So there was a lot of this kind of crackdown and suspension of civil liberties that was going on during World War I. So when the war was all said and done, millions of people had lost their lives. 10 million soldiers were killed altogether in World War I, which was absolutely devastating, especially to European populations. But as you can see, Americans sacrificed quite a lot as well. 112,000 Americans will lose their lives in World War I. 20 million soldiers will be wounded in World War I, some of them permanently disfigured as a result of mustard gas attacks and other types of things. And at least 1 million civilian casualties. So about a million civilians will die in World War I, which sounds like a lot of innocent people dying, but in fact, we're going to see those numbers skyrocket when we get to World War II. if we look at these pie charts, they give you a sense of the percentage of World War I military deaths. This is for the Entente. And you can see here the United States is just 2% of that pie chart. The Russian Empire is 32%, the British Empire 20%, and the Third French Republic 24%. So you can see here that the Russians are actually going to be the European nation that will lose the most soldiers on the side of the Entente. If we switch over here to the Central Powers, really no surprise here that the majority of the deaths will occur for German soldiers. The second largest is Austria-Hungary, with 10% being from the Ottoman Empire. So what happens after World War I? How does the peace process unfold? Well, that's what we're going to discuss next. We're going to discuss one of the most important treaties in the history of the world, really, because this is an international treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. And what you're looking at here is a picture of the prime ministers from England and France, and then in the center there, you see the American president, Woodrow Wilson, who, after the end of the war, travels to Europe to attend this international peace conference that's taking place at the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris in France. And you can see that everybody seems very happy. They're throwing flowers at his feet. And there is a real sense of hope, right? That this person who has crafted these 14 points, who is going to ensure lasting peace, is now come to Europe to try to negotiate that peace. And these are the types of crowds that came out to greet Woodrow Wilson when he toured around Europe. This is a crowd in Milan that's come out to celebrate the fact that this American president has come to negotiate these peace talks. And if you click on that link right there, that will take you to a video that will give you an overview of the Paris Peace Conference, gives you some cool moving images. It has kind of outdated British narration, but it is, I think, a very good video in giving us an overview of what that peace process was about. Because unfortunately, what ends up happening is that the English and the French are not interested in creating any kind of peace with Germany. In fact, what they're more interested in doing is ensuring that Germany is punished and disabled militarily. So let's talk about the Paris Peace Conference and the Versailles Treaty. And there's quite a lot of information here. So I'm going to go through it point by point. But if you have any additional questions about this, please let me know, and I can address those either in our office hours, or I can also answer email questions. So there were 27 nations that came to the Paris Peace Conference, but there were three major players there. That was President Wilson for the United States, obviously our president, Prime Ministers Georges Clemenceau, who was the French representative, and David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Britain. There were no representatives there at the conference from the Central Powers, Germany or Austria-Hungary. And Russia was not at this peace conference, mainly because Russia had dropped out of the war early, and they were busy fighting their own sort of internal battles between the Bolsheviks and the nationalists, and they were basically having a full-scale civil war in Russia by this time. So that's important because there were some really important voices that were missing from this. Why is the Versailles Treaty important? Well, very simply, it outlines the conditions for peace after World War I. The other reason why it's important is it also leads to a whole lot of problems after World War I, and I will explain those in a minute. Wilson, for his part, brings his 14 points, right? And he's super idealistic and he's thinking to himself, I'm going to make this international peace work, and he brings his 14 points to the table. As I mentioned before, unfortunately, not a whole lot of those points are actually going to be incorporated into the final treaty. So what does a treaty do? Well, the very first thing that you need to realize is that immediately there were problems with this treaty, mostly because England and France had secret motives. They were imperialist motives, meaning they wanted to take territory from Germany, both in Africa and in China. They also wanted to ensure that Germany would be weak moving forward. So they wanted to disarm their military, or at least limit the size of their military. And they also wanted to cripple them economically, because prior to World War I, Germany was becoming a real sort of economic competitor with these other European nations. So here's some of the things that were added into the treaty that become a problem later on. So there was an article written into the treaty. It's Article 231. It's also known as the War Guilt Clause. And basically what that article says is that Germany is solely responsible for this war. And in many ways, when you think about it, that's not really true, because remember that the war originally started with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire wanting to attack Serbia and then Russia coming to their defense, right? But the reason why they had to add this article to the treaty is because of this next point. In order for Germany to pay reparations for the war, basically like a fine, right, for having started this war, they had to place all the blame on Germany to make that happen. So Article 231 is actually related to this second point, that Germany has to pay $33 billion in war reparations. And this was, payments over time. And those reparation payments were going to England, they were going to France, they were going to Belgium, they were going to countries that were directly impacted by Germany's wartime aggression. Okay. The other thing that the treaty does is it shrinks the size of Germany pretty significantly. 10% of its population and territory will be taken as a result of this treaty, and we'll talk about how that happens in a minute. There was a clause in the treaty that was denied to the Japanese. This was the racial equality clause. So the Japanese had a delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, and the Japanese were an up-and-coming industrial nation. They had supported the Allies during World War I, and they wanted some recognition of racial equality between Japanese people and Europeans. And this was very problematic for a lot of the European powers at the table. And so they were actually denied. They had requested that this racial equality clause be put into the treaty, but they were actually denied it. And they were very upset by that. However, they were given some territory, some former German territory in China. So the Germans had these more like trading outposts in China, trade agreements, access to harbors and ports and things like that in China. Those were taken from Germany and given to Japan. That's significant because the Japanese moving into the 1920s will start to have their own imperialistic motivations in Asia. And so eventually what they're going to do is they're going to want to invade China. And this is sort of giving them the first step to making that happen. And then finally, no colonies are granted independence in these negotiations. And this was extremely disappointing to a lot of the attendees of the concert. of the conference. Okay. In addition to the political problems that this treaty sets up, there are some additional geopolitical settlements that will become problematic moving forward. First off, a huge number of Eastern European nations are created out of what was former German territory, some Russian territories, and also Austria-Hungary. And I'm going to show you a map in a minute that's going to reflect that. The Ottoman Empire is basically dissolved, and the country of Turkey is created on the Anatolian Peninsula. So the Turkey is basically going to, the country of Turkey, which did not exist prior to World War I, is going to be created as a result of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. There are mandates placed on the Middle East by France and Britain in places like Lebanon and Syria and Palestine and Jordan and Iran. And these are all, this is very important because what's going to happen is when the European powers, France and England, take over these Middle Eastern countries, they're coming into areas that they don't really understand politically, nor do they understand it culturally. And so it's going to cause a lot of political instability that will eventually lead to the conflicts that we are still seeing in the Middle East today. And then finally, you have the Balfour Declaration, which is a declaration that was made between the Britain and Jewish Zionists in 1917. So the Jewish Zionists in the early 20th century had really been promoting this idea of having a Jewish homeland. And Britain basically pledges this promise to Jewish Zionists in the 19-teens that this will happen in the future. And they will have the power to make that happen because the British will control Palestine. And so it's significant because what happens is Palestine becomes a British mandate after World War I. And then after World War II, that is when Palestine is given over to a Jewish governing body, and it will become the country of Israel. And this, of course, is going to give rise to conflicts between Jews and Palestinians living in that region. So this is the map of Europe after World War I. And you can see there all of those countries in that beige color, beginning at Finland and ending down there in Yugoslavia, are all countries that are going to be carved out of other former territories and will become independent. So that is very significant. You will also notice that Romania will gain some territory. That was part of their agreement that they had with the Allies to join World War I on the side of the Allies. You'll notice that the country of Turkey is now going to be created right there on the Anatolian Peninsula. And then down there in the Middle East, you see Syria and Lebanon, which will become French mandates. And Iraq and, it wasn't Iran, it was Iraq and Transjordan and Palestine will all become mandates of the British. And again, I mentioned the significance of that. So borders are changing, geopolitical dynamics are changing as a result of this, and this will have lasting consequences. So most of Wilson's 14 points were not directly integrated into the Treaty of Versailles, but there was one that was fully integrated into the Treaty of Versailles, and that is the League of Nations. Wilson had proposed in his 14 points to make a League of Nations. This would be an international diplomatic body whose job it was to basically ensure that peace would be lasting. and that there would be, you know, if a nation was becoming aggressive or if there was something wrong, that they would basically be put in check by this League of Nations. Think of it as the predecessor to the United Nations. So this League of Nations clause was fully integrated into the Treaty of Versailles. But when Wilson comes home from the Paris Peace Conference and tries to sell the League of Nations Charter and this part of the treaty to the United States Senate, because the president doesn't have the power to ratify a treaty, he has to bring it back to the Senate for ratification. And so the senators, many of whom were actually Wilson's kind of political enemies, had a problem with some of the articles of the treaty, and particularly the Article 10 of the League of Nations Charter, which said that that the League had the power to punish aggressor nations economically or with military retaliation. The United States did not want to be tied to other countries when it came to our decisions about diplomacy. And so the ratification of the League of Nations Charter was blocked by the Senate, the U.S. Senate. So this is the irony. A United States president comes to the Paris Peace Conference with this idea for a League of Nations, but the United States actually never joins the League of Nations. Other countries will, and a bunch of other countries join it, including all the European countries, but the United States never does. And a lot of that has to do with Wilson's political opponents at the time. So the treaty's final defeat. So the United States ultimately does not join the League of Nations. The treaty is ratified by European nations. And the other problem with the treaty is that the US and Europe have decided that they're going to implement this policy of self-determination by making all of those Eastern European nations independent. But it's only European nations that are being allowed this, and instead all these colonized countries throughout the world are really getting mad that they are not going to be allowed to be independent, and they are still going to be colonies of European nations. And then finally, these conditions, these punishments that were placed especially on Germany through the treaty, and the failure of the League of Nations to keep the peace will really contribute significantly to the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany and the start of World War II. And when we talk about World War II, we'll talk about the ways in which that happens. So that's it. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll be available via office hour or through email. Have a good one.